Not only has the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa grabbed the world's attention, but many Albertans are watching how the blockade at the Coutts border crossing is playing out. On Tuesday, police said the blockade is illegal and have brought in restrictions. But will the truckers leave? They say they will not until the COVID-19 mandates are scrapped. To talk about this in more detail is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining us from Edmonton. Tyler, what's the Premier saying about this blockade?
Well, it's frankly a little bit of a mixed message. I think that's fair to say. He says on one hand that he agrees actually with the proposition that the cross-border vaccine mandate for truckers should be dropped. However, he did say that, it's time to lower the temperature for people to listen to the police and for everything to sort of calm down. Tensions running a little bit high in Coutts, so far as we can tell, with some of the local residents upset about it, and obviously traffic through the region pretty much shut down as far as we know. So the Premier had, some strong words, but then also sort of, maybe trying to calm things a little bit by saying, look, I hear you, I sympathize with your frustration.
Now, would the Premier consider implementing that new legislation? Do you remember the one that was passed not long ago saying that you cannot interrupt with pipelines, you can't have blockades on our railways? Well, how about a major highway, coming through the U.S.-Canada border?
That's right. And so the UCPs found themselves in a little bit of an interesting spot because, of course, they don't want to be seen as interfering in a police operation. For example, the Premier was asked on Tuesday whether or not he would consider meeting with the protesters. And he said, look, there's a police operation going on right now. I'm not going to get involved in and sort of mess that up. And a similar sort of thing has happened with I think it was Bill 1, which is the bit of a mouthful, the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act. And so the RCMP, in their statements about this, have cited that act, saying that this protest is unlawful because of some of those provisions, in addition to possibly other charges under maybe the criminal code or highway traffic provisions. So that act is actually very much in play here. And Doug Schweitzer, who is I think, Innovation, Jobs and Economy Minister at the moment, was asked about it earlier this week, and he said that this is exactly the sort of scenario, actually, that the Critical Infrastructure Defense Act was brought in to address. So much of, I would say, what we see the police doing and what they're going to do is probably going to be informed by that piece of legislation.
Now, Tyler, our Premier was in the United States recently talking to some of the governors about the vaccine mandate for the truckers. I mean, it expired, but then it was implemented again by the feds. Where did it actually go when Kenny talked to the governors when it comes to the truckers and this vaccine mandate?
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to say. So he was down at sort of an annual general meeting of governors. He'd been talking on the phone, apparently, with some of the sort of border governors over the last couple weeks about this issue. And they'd said, why don't you come down and talk to some of us? So he told the media that he had, a number of sort of formal sit downs with governors. He didn't specify who, and then a number of other conversations just sort of on the, margins of this conference. It's a little bit unclear where it goes next. He did say that some of the governors said this was the sort of thing they were going to raise with the Biden administration, because of course the Biden administration has a similar rule. So it's not just a Canadian law or rule, it's also an American one. So, there's sort of two governments to deal with here. So it's hard to say what will come of that. But it is, as I sort of mentioned before, a sign that the Premier does sort of agree with at least this one portion of the protest movement and has actually been actively working to achieve what some of the protesters want.
Did Premier Kenny actually talk with the Biden administration while he was in Washington about the potential of bringing back Keystone XL?
I'm sure it came up in his conversations. I don't know if they've had any direct conversations with the Biden administration about it. We do have sort of a trade mission in Washington that I'm sure is doing some of this lobbying here and there. And honestly, and we haven't heard very much about it on the federal level either, which is maybe where you'd expect some of these sort of bilateral discussions to happen. It seems like for now, though, that the pipeline is sort of dead in the water. Of course, if anyone ever decides to start it up, I don't think the link up section that needs to be completed is all that big. So it probably wouldn't take, an enormous amount of effort to get the project restarted. But of course, it's in limbo, and there's they had to dismantle portions of it and all that. So it seems like, as far as I can tell, it's sort of an Energy East situation where the idea exists, but the project itself is pretty thoroughly scrapped.
What's interesting is how the Biden administration has been asking OPEC to increase output. It's like, hey, Canada, right here, your neighbors. We've got the oil that you guys need. We've got the fuels. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. We'll keep an eye on that. Now, Tyler, Premier Kenny says by the end of this month, Alberta will begin dropping some of the COVID-19 related public health measures, including the vaccine passport system.
Yeah, it's a little bit confusing, I have to say, because a few days ago he said by the end of March, and then on Tuesday he said sort of end of February. So let's say, generously timeline anywhere from the next 4 to 8 weeks, perhaps we might see the relaxation of some of these things. And the vaccine passport, as you say, did get a specific mention there. So the metrics aren't there yet. Hospitalization rates are still at sort of record highs. We're not through this yet, even if it perhaps feels like it for a lot of people. So nothing sort of imminent. And he was really pressed by some reporters on Tuesday about a roadmap. When is this going to happen? What is it going to look like? What are the benchmarks? And he did promise that that was coming, but no, straightforward, explicit announcement of those things. And the other thing to keep in mind, of course, is that this is going to become a major political issue for him when he decides to do that. Obviously his supporters are probably going to like it. The New Democrats are going to be, screaming bloody murder about it. So once the legislature is back in session, everyone's, shouting at each other in question period. I have no doubt we're going to hear an awful lot about this in the weeks and months to come.
Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe was talking about it's not a matter of if, but when they're going to lift all of the mandates as well here and try and get back to normal. Moe was saying that this is COVID is just something we're going to have to learn to live with. Is that kind of the same mindset with Premier Jason Kenney in the UCP?
I think that's probably fair to say. That was one of the things that they tried to do back in August, I guess it would have been, trying to move from this pandemic to endemic management. And then, of course, the whole thing was sidelined by the Delta wave, and the plan was sort of, I don't want to say scrapped, but sidelined for the time being. But certainly, I think that's the way it's going. And it's not just Saskatchewan that's looked at opening up. Ontario opened up some of its facilities, bars and restaurants, I think, that have been closed for a considerable period of time. Earlier this week, Monday, I think. I've been thinking about this a lot, Hal, and so I'll maybe just mention it. It's very interesting because Alberta's oddly had it easier than almost everywhere else in the country in terms of restrictions, and it doesn't feel like that, I think, for a lot of people. But it's when you look at Ontario and Quebec, it's just a completely different world.
Absolutely. My daughter works in the hospitality industry as a cook in Southern Ontario, and it's really hit her restaurant very, very hard. It's a miracle that they've actually survived to this point. Tyler, final numbers came out in regards to fundraising for both the UCP and the NDP here in Alberta, and the NDP raised around $2 million more than the UCP?
Yeah, it's shocking. Normally you would expect a Conservative Party to really out-earn a Progressive Party. And the NDP has led over a couple of quarters, and so there's been a couple other headlines about this in the last little while. But the final numbers are pretty astonishing. A little over $6 million to the NDP and just under $4 million to the UCP. So it's hard to say exactly what's going on there. I think we've talked about it before. The NDP has been a very effective, bullish, loud opposition party over the course of the pandemic, and Premier Jason Kenney's popularity has really gone down over the course of the pandemic. So I think if you take those two factors, it sort of makes sense that you see this discrepancy in fundraising numbers. But of course, we have an election coming up in a year and a bit, 14 months, 15 months kind of thing. So these are the sort of numbers that they start to matter at a certain point when it comes to pre-election advertising, when it comes to election advertising, when it comes to even things like how many events a party can put on, what their bus looks like, whether they can bring media along for the tour, those sorts of questions. So really, it's sort of a numbers story that's dry on the face of it, but it really actually quite a consequential little news update when it comes to the fundraising numbers, I'd say.
Tyler, we're looking at a potential leadership review for Premier Kenney this spring. How do you think that'll play out?
It's a great question. And, it's really hard to say. The sense that I have gotten from the Kenney camp is that they're going to fight this out. There's not an obvious successor at the moment to Jason Kenney. There's, a lot of opposition. That really had a lot of steam coming into the United Conservative AGM last year that, and it's hard to say what that steam looks like, how organized this is. And of course, we also saw at the UCP AGM this attempt by some of Jason Kenney's opponents, I guess, to take over much of the UCP board, which it did not succeed. So there's all sorts of things that are at play here, what type of convention it's going to be, if it's going to be virtual, all these things that sort of matter for the on the ground logistics of how this might play out. But I think because of the economic news that has been reasonably good over the last little while, that Kenney's people have felt pretty good about the leadership review. And of course, going into the leadership review, which I believe is scheduled for early April, if I'm not mistaken, though I admit I'm blanking a little bit on it. The point is, restrictions are going to start lifting in lead up to this leadership review, which I think would be fair to say will take some of the steam or some of the wind out of the sails of Jason Kenney's opponents within the party.
Yeah, that might be really good timing for, like you said, Jason Kenney and the party as we head up to the next provincial election next year. Tyler, Alberta announced a new incentive program to get more doctors to come to rural areas. How much money are we talking about? How will this really work?
Yeah, I believe it's about $20 million. And so the idea is basically straight up payments to people who will go work in rural communities. So I think they're looking at about 15 doctors or 20 doctors in 15 or 20 communities that really need them. And the way it sort of works out is there's, I think, a $60,000 grant available to pay tuition costs or student loan costs, I guess, and then bonus payments between $20,000 and $40,000 to physicians who choose to go to these rural areas. This has been an issue that has been sort of percolating with the UCP for some time. A year or two ago, they'd talked, for example, about when people graduated from medical school, sort of sending them places where they were needed, sort of like how the RCMP sends people to, places all over the country that need police officers. The status of that plan, I actually don't know. But the point is they've been sort of thinking about policy options on this front for some time because, of course, it is a big issue in rural areas and small towns and frankly, some larger towns as well.
Now, some other good news. Alberta nurses signed a new agreement with the province, Tyler. The deal, which is good until the year 2024, will see nurses receive, a 4.25% pay increase on top of other things?
This has been sort of an ongoing issue for the United Conservatives, this negotiation with the nurses, and it's been happening at sort of a very charged time, of course, as nurses have been working quite hard during the pandemic. So there's been this odd dynamic that has become a political dynamic between the New Democrats and the UCP with regards to fighting nurses over contracts while also needing them to be working during the pandemic. So it's been sort of this strange dynamic. But yeah, that's right. The United Nurses of Alberta, which represents, I believe, about 30,000 nurses in the province, has signed this deal. So a little bit of peace, perhaps, on the labor front for the next little while, which will also, of course, matter a little bit to the budget considerations when the budget comes out in the next month or so, I would imagine.
Now, the province put in some new rules asking supervised injection sites to collect identification and health card information. Now, drug safety advocates sued the province but lost, paving the way for the rule to come into effect.
This is another really interesting one. The basic idea is that someone who goes into one of these sites would need to present ID and a health card. The idea being to sort of link them up with other health supports at a certain point. Now, sort of drug safety advocates, as you mentioned, didn't like this. They say people don't have a health card, they don't have identification, so it sort of would preclude them from accessing these sites. So they went to court, they sued, they lost, and the court basically said that yes, it's possible this will restrict access, but the evidence isn't there to sort of block the implementation of this. It was supposed to come into effect this week, Monday or Tuesday. It won't now. The UCP has actually pushed it back to April. And the reason for that has nothing to do with the court case, but it does have to do with sort of the collection of health information, like a health card number. And so there just needs to be some sort of bureaucratic changes, I guess, to sort of which providers can collect this information, get them registered or whatever in order for them to actually go ahead with this. So that rule, barring an appeal to a higher level court, the Supreme Court of Canada perhaps, which of course would take a considerable amount of time, this rule will go into effect in a couple months here.
Has the province also talked about more help when it comes to intox and detox beds to really help those who want to get off of drugs?
Well, they have over the course of their tenure in government. I don't think I could pull a specific number out or think of a super recent announcement, but that has been a large focus of theirs over the course of the pandemic. The course of their time in government, bringing more money in for detox and also sort of general mental health spending. What that has done on the ground, I honestly don't know, but the idea was certainly to have more of these supports available because their idea, their philosophy very much is to try and transition people off of drugs at some point. So they've been really sort of bullish on that, which of course has caused tension between some harm reduction advocates and the government.
Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.